baseball oddballs are something that we've talked before about in the past, but given that such a long game with such a colorful history, we've kind of come to find out we didn't even scratch the surface.
Yeah, and I was trying to find guys in today's baseball that have the oddities. It seems like it's something that years ago, it seems odd to us because it was such a long time ago, and what they did seemed weird.
And there was so much more novelty to it.
Right. So we had players like, and I was almost afraid to bring this guy up because what I remember about him, his name is Jimmy Pearsall. Mm-hmm. So Jimmy Pearsall was a good major league player, but he also had some bipolar disorder. He had definite issues that transcended his play onto the field and in the locker room, and he was so unable to do things early in his career. He wrote a book, and they made a movie about it called Fear Strikes Out while he was a player.
That's got to be strange.
Anthony Perkins played him.
That's
Psycho Anthony Perkins, right, played Jimmy Pearsall. And so Jimmy Pearsall would just do things that people did not understand. In fact, that he didn't understand. I remember when reading about him as a Met. So he finished his career with the Mets, and he hit his 100th career home run with the Mets. He was playing for Casey Stengel at that time. Mm-hmm. He ran around the bases backwards. So can you imagine a guy hits a home and he turns around and runs backwards all around
and everybody's just kind of watching this go on.
Like what is he doing? And he basically sort of leaned into it after a while, going, well, I was kind of an older player with not much going for me, and I had
brand.
I had that kind of was his brand. So he got suspended. He a number of times he was caught in situations with Babe Ruth that people didn't want to talk about. I just felt that this is a guy who, because they made the movie about him, and he wasn't like this great baseball player, he was just a good baseball player.
Right. So it was kind of interesting why he but because he was so quirky and interesting, people paid attention to him.
Right. And he didn't really have, he was trying to keep, people were trying to keep jobs today. And I wonder if some of what he was doing, battling, mental illness, was also leaning into it at times because he wanted to make sure that he had a job.
True. Yeah. And I think there's so many guys like obviously Jimmy Pearsall is a bit of an unusual case given that he was actually struggling with diagnosed and undiagnosed mental problems. But baseball players are also just weird because they believe in so many superstitions. Obviously, Moises Alou used to pee on his hands to make them tougher.
To toughen him up.
Right. And then you have a guy like Turk Wendell, who would always go out to pitch with not just one piece of black licorice in his mouth, but 4.
Did you ever see? You didn't see Turk pitch?
I did see him pitch because he pitched for the Mets for a little bit.
He had the shark teeth necklace around his.
No, it wasn't just shark teeth. Apparently, it was hundreds of different animals on this necklace. It was just animal teeth all around his neck that he would wear out. He wore number 99. He signed a contract for $9,999,000 and it was like
and 99 cents.
Why was it that specific?
And he was so superstitious that he would jump over the foul line as he came off the field. He was, and the other thing I remember as a pitcher, Turk Wendell, and this is not an oddball thing, I don't think he threw another pitch but a slider. Every single time. Everybody knew he was going to throw a slider. He knew he was going to throw a slider at the batting guy, and he was still effective. Like Mariano's cutter. He was a very effective relief pitcher on some very good Met teams.
Oh, yeah.
So, Turk Wendell, I remember him well, and he's still out there doing interviews now. I heard him recently, and he's like, well, they get paid a lot of money, a lot more money than I did. So, and how about a guy that you've heard about and was part of the Gas House Gang teams, Jay Hanna, Dizzy Dean.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, right. Jay Hanna, Dizzy Dean.
I'm like, as soon as you say Dizzy Dean, I'm like, I know who that is.
So Dizzy Dean was the last National League pitcher to win 30 games in a season.
Wow.
So we know Denny McLain won 31 in 1968, but he started as a 19-year-old, and the way that he got his name. So here's a story I read. I don't even know if I can even believe some of this stuff. So as he took to the box when he's 19, in the pitcher's box as they called him, he was proceeded to be called a dizzy kid for the rest of the game. Knock the dizzy kid out of the box is what they were saying. So because he was 19, and somehow the moniker stuck. And so that he became
right. So I guess we would try to say he's in over his head. He's a kid pitching in the major leagues, not got the dizzy kid because everything's making him swirl around or something.
But on that team, they had Dazzy Vance and Ducky Medwick. So Dizzy, Dazzy, and Ducky. I mean, are you serious? So, and his brother Paul was a teammate of his.
Didn't they throw back like?
No. So the story goes that Dizzy pitches the first game of a doubleheader, and he throws a one-hitter.
Yep.
Okay, and then Paul goes out and pitches the second game of the doubleheader and pitches a no-hitter. And after the game, he goes, God, if I'd have known Paul was going to throw a no-hitter, I'd have thrown one too. So, and he had this, he was from Tennessee, and he played into the homespun, backwoods kind of a guy, and with his aphorisms, and he was an announcer later in his career, and he came up with the idea that the player had slud into third base, so he came up with a past participle of slid and turned it into slud. And I think he's also the guy that came up with the players are going out there, they're respectable positions. Like the respective positions, but he said it kind of wrong.
Respectable positions.
They're respectable.
Like they're doing something else out there.
So, and okay, so here's a story. In 1937, he bet he could strike out Joe DiMaggio's brother Vince 4 times in the game. He struck him out the first 3 at-bats, but when DiMaggio hit a pop-up behind the plate in the 4th, Dean screamed at his catcher, drop it! Drop it! So the catcher did, and then he fanned DiMaggio on the next pitch. Few in the press now doubted his boast, as he was fond of saying, if you done it, it ain't bragging.
I think it's interesting because you have a guy like Dizzy Dean who was kind of playing into that whole like country persona. But then you have a guy who was another fellow Hall of Famer in Rube Waddle who was just 100% that guy. This guy was bonkers. He was a volunteer firefighter in his part-time, and he was so...
When you were like carrying pails of water.
He was so obsessed with fire trucks, there were reports of him literally just leaving the game to go look at fire trucks that were passing by. There's stories of him leaving the game to go fishing in the middle of it because he wanted to go fish. I just think it's so interesting because, there was discovered at one point during an offseason, he was wrestling alligators. Like, think about that. Think about if we were freaking out because what's his name? Cespedes was riding horses at his ranch in the offseason.
Cespedes fell off the horse.
This guy was wrestling gators.
Ended his career. So I guess that would be an oddball thing to do as well. So remember that spring training where Syndergaard and Cespedes showed up on horses in spring training in Florida, and like what are these guys doing?
And he was also affectionately given the name of a southpaw because of how much he drank instead of a southpaw.
But the guy was a hell of a pitcher. He's a Hall of Fame pitcher,
right? That's what wild thing is. Like we talk about him like he's a joke. He was one of the best pitchers of all time.
And like Dizzy Dean, I think Dizzy Dean, I guess, hurt his toe and then changed his motion, got a sore arm, and was never the same pitcher again. And I think Rube Waddle had something similar happen. He got an injury, and all of a sudden he lost his mojo. And he
just was never the same.
Right.
Guy.
He had like almost like a Koufax stretch of brilliance, and then he's pitching back in the teens and stuff like that.
Long time ago.
It's really a long time. So he was quite something. Now, what do you know about Marvelous Marv? You're a Met fan, right? Have you even heard the term Marvelous Marv?
No, I go to think of Val Venus from pro wrestling when I hear that name.
Well, you could have said Marvin. So there was a boxer named Marvin Hagler, had some great fights back in the 80s, and he was called Marvelous Marvin Hagler, and he liked that so much that he changed his name legally to Marvelous. But Marvelous Marv Thornberry, Marvin Eugene Thornberry, was actually a Yankee phenom as a young age and was supposed to come up and be a home run hitter and power hitter. But by the time he got to the 62 Mets, he was the guy that really didn't have,
I think all you have to say is the guy ended up on the 62 Mets.
Playing for Casey Stengel again, who he played for when he was on the Yankees.
But you didn't end up on the 62 Mets because you were having a great career at that point.
So, and he was a guy who was a terrible fielder. I think he had one of the the worst defensive wars ever. And he was on that team that Casey Stengel said he was for their execution. So he was one of those guys.
Known for having 17 errors at first base in just 97 games.
So he didn't last long, but he was sort of lovable, and he hit home runs, and the fans liked him because he was kind of a power hitter, and he was sort of the embodiment of the 62 Mets futility.
I got to think that any guy back then that hit more than 15 home runs was probably at least a bit of a fan favorite, just because nobody did that back then except the superstars. So if you even showed the flashes of being able to do that, fans would love you.
Right, and the teammates loved him, but on a team that's 40 and 120, he was not even the star player. A guy named Frank Thomas was the star, but Marv Thornberry was the beloved, embodiment of the sad sack Mets. I think he played a couple of years, for the Mets before he was gone. And he just did all kinds of base running mistakes. He got thrown out in situations that you couldn't even understand. And then later in life he got on to, and my friend Mike Berkman was producing these commercials back in the '80s, the light beer for Miller commercials. So if you look back in the '80s, they had these football players, Dick Butkus and Bubba Smith, and Marv Thornberry was in the commercial, and his only line was, "I don't know why I'm in this commercial."
That's good.
And it's like Marvelous Marv, like, what's he doing then? They had all these other star
Big
athletes.
name athletes.
Right?
And then there's this guy that was a player for a bad Mets team.
So that's how people got introduced to Marv, who, if you weren't from New York, like, who the hell is that guy? Oh, that's Marvelous Marv, who played for the Mets. And so that's how he also, kind of had a second,
I think it's interesting how some
notoriety.
players can have that like second, rise in notoriety, because that happened to another guy in Wade Boggs. Because I know you don't know this because you don't watch the show, but a few years ago, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia did an episode on Wade Boggs where they tried to complete the Wade Boggs challenge, which is drowning an entire case of beer on a flight from Philadelphia to Tampa.
And of course, if it was Wade Boggs, he would have to eat fried chicken.
Right, because he would eat 4 pieces of fried chicken before every game.
Every single game.
He would take 150 ground balls, no more, no less, exactly 150. And apparently he was a prolific drinker.
And I think he would take batting practice precisely at like 5:07.
5:17.
5:17 at the same time every day. Now, this is a man who's in the Hall of Fame. So,
Clearly wasn't gonna hit 328 for his career.
328. Yeah, that man was an amazing hitter.
You don't hit that by mistake.
So yeah, but he had, and they reported that kind of behavior, this odd behavior that he had while he was playing. We don't get stuff like that, from guys today.
One, I think part of it is this: you don't have the reporter following the team in the same way, where those like little nuanced quirks become like a charming part of the season. Because if the player wants to broadcast that, he gets on Twitter or X and does it himself now.
Well, I was going to say that, and so it's social media is what changes it, because the players are in more control of their own image and depiction.
Where they get to go, look at LeBron James, even though he's not a baseball player. That the entire image he puts out on social media is very, very, crafted.
Cultivated.
Yeah, cultivated. He's really trying to put out a particular image, and I think for a lot of players, that's what they're trying to do now, because it's how they grow their own personal brand.
Right.
And some guys probably would have had it way easier building their personal brand. A guy like Mark Fidrich. I mean,
yeah, I wish you'd have seen Fidrich pitch. He didn't pitch very long.
No, but I mean, a guy coming out like that who was so good as a rookie, looking kind of weird and unusual.
Oh, he had the hair coming out from under the cap, so he had this really yellow curly, and he was like 19 or something like that.
6'3", gangly.
The Bird, they called him because he looked like Big Bird from Sesame Street. That's why they called him the Bird.
And he was a great pitcher, but just
had a year, that rookie year, I think it was 19-9.
And you feel bad because injuries are really the reason why his career was derailed.
Right, but he would, he'd be on the mound, and he would be talking to the baseball, and you'd see him. Just imagine a pitcher doing this today. Like, he walks off the rubber, he'd behind the pitcher going, okay, ball. Now you're going to go there past this guy, and he's not going to hit you at all. He would actually talk to the ball.
And you don't think they wouldn't make commercials with him doing that today?
Right. And could you even do that today? Would you be ostracized?
I think the problem is that too many people would see you doing it as a lark. You know what I mean? Like, you would
smoothing the mound out, doing all this weird stuff that nobody else did.
It worked for him because he was so. That was actually him doing it. I think it would come off as very forced if you saw a pitcher do that today, unless the pitcher already was kind of known as being a bit of an oddball. If Scherzer all of a sudden stepped off the mound tomorrow, turned around and started talking to the ball, everybody would be like, "What the hell is he doing?"
Right. If he did it all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the thing about Fidrich. He was the rookie of the year, and because of that, you can do that and be weird when you're excelling at what you're doing, because people will put up with it.
As you start struggling.
Right. I remember watching Rigetti pitch for the Yankees. I think he was a starter, and he gave up a home run. So this is one oddity, right? He gives up a home run. He gets the ball from the umpire. He turns and he chucks it over the right field fence. I've never seen a
And I'm
pitcher
sure-
do that.
and I'm sure-
And I was so impressed because it's so far.
Everybody, and people were torn between being impressed and just confused. Like, do you give him another ball? What if he just does it again?
So baseball players do odd stuff like that, but when it's consistent behavior, and so Fidrich, what he was doing this all the time.
Right. So it was not just a lark.
Right. This was his vibe, and he's talking about being an iconoclast, and not getting away with it. Unfortunately, you're right about the injuries, and his career was far too short. And when we did our first podcast about Oddballs, we talked about Bill Veeck, and we're going to do. I'm reading a Bill Veeck.
We kind of have to do.
I'm going to do a Bill Veeck episode.
There are few people more interesting in the tapestry
We
of
talk
baseball.
about him a lot on this podcast, and we've also talked about Charlie Finley a few times on the podcast.
No relation to Chuck.
Not always in the most positive sense. And I kind of remember him for the stupid thing he did in the 1973 World Series, owning the A's, when Mike Andrews made a couple of errors in the series game, and he tried to get him to sign, a release, and Bowie Kuhn stopped that from happening, from firing essentially the player for making errors in the game.
middle of a series.
And then they wouldn't pay him his World Series share because of that. I mean, just so
like they still won.
I just feel like Charlie. But when I looked more at the guy's career, he was more of an oddball than a bad person. Number one, he's the guy that came up with the colors. So remember, he owned the A's. They moved them from Kansas City, right, Philadelphia to Kansas City from 55 to 64, and then they moved to Oakland,
and to Vegas.
And now, well, they haven't done that yet, but yeah. And so the uniforms, right, and when they went to these green and yellow and stuff, like nobody was wearing that kind of stuff. So as a promoter,
I probably did an amazing thing because you knew exactly.
They had a brand,
playing.
right? They had a brand, and so in that respect, as a promoter, he was sort of before his time, and he owned other pro teams. I think he owned the Colorado Rockies before they moved to another thing. There was a Colorado Rockies hockey team.
Before
they became the New Jersey Devils.
And then they brought back the Avalanche.
Maybe it was the Kansas City Scouts. It was the Kansas City Scouts because he was from Kansas City. That's right. And so he owned other teams, but he had the Beatles come to the West Coast. Right, the Beatles in '64 came to Shea Stadium, but he got them to go to Kansas City, and they played for like $150,000, and they played, and he wanted them to play longer. They only played a 30-minute set at the time. So. Like, how do you fly all the way to Kansas City and play 30 minutes up? But that's what the Beatles...
That's like 5 songs.
Because they're the freaking Beatles,
and
they can do whatever they want. And he was trying to convince them, and I think they didn't succumb, and they did what they wanted to do, and they didn't get what he wanted. So Finley was, also the guy who would like try to sell his players along the lines of what Steinbrenner was doing at the time.
And when you say sell, literally just be like, yeah, I'll give you this guy for like $500,000.
Yeah, for money. And so he got Bowie Kuhn's best interest of baseball for other things other than just firing Mike Andrews as a player. So he attempted to sell Raleigh Fingers, Hall of Famer, and a good left fielder, Joe Rudy, to the Red Sox for $1 million each, and Vita Blue to the Yankees for $1.5 million. He needed the money, and Bowie Kuhn said no.
Right, and I can kind of understand that because you shouldn't be weakening your baseball team because you've made bad business decisions.
But as we talked about in our commissioner episode, last night, would Rob Manfred do anything like that today if
Not
Steve Cohen decides to sell and eat Justin Verlander's
because we watched
contract?
him do that already. But
it happens.
It was different, though. I will say this. It is different because Cohen was getting assets back for his team that can help them in the future. It's really hard to argue that selling the players for cash is doing the same thing.
Here's what I'll say about that. I will say that, yes, you can make the argument that they paid for what is premium talent, but they paid a ridiculous premium.
I'm not disagreeing.
That is a premium that is far overvalues what the player could almost ever produce.
Not disagreeing with that.
So let's be,
But cash is different.
Right. So I think that when you talk about oddballs, there's one other guy who's an oddball just because he's a character. I don't know. He's an oddball because he's odd. So he had his own television show. Mm-hmm. After his playing career, he's still around today, and he's still calling games in Milwaukee.
And he was a big part of a very famous baseball movie.
That's right, and that would be Mr. Bob Uecker, Mr. Baseball.
Major League is a great movie.
I talked about the light beer from Miller commercials with Marv Thornberry. Well, Bob Uecker was in there, and part of that whole vibe there is that he missed the tag, and Bob Uecker is up in the farthest left field upper deck corner,
Calling the game.
calling the game, sitting alone because there's nobody there. It's an empty stadium, and that's the seat. Good seats. Hey, buddy. Yeah, I must be in the front row. And they walk him all the way up to this seat in the farthest left corner of the stadium. Oh, yeah, I know.
Just a bit outside.
He's sitting down, and they pick him up, and they make him move. And that's where they make him move to. Oh, I must be moving down to. So his self-deprecation is obviously his vibe. And so he would go on Johnny Carson back in the day. And, I think Euchre hit like 204 for his career.
Not great.
So Johnny says, Major League Baseball catcher Bob Euchre, welcome to the show. Yes, my record speaks for itself. and so he would just talk about, and he's the guy, remember the joke I told you about, when he caught Phil Niekro, the knuckleballer, he goes, well, the best way to catch a knuckleball is to wait for it to stop rolling and then pick it up.
You can tell this man was bored for television.
Right, so he ended up on a show called Mr. Belvedere.
Oh, I know that show.
Right, so Bob Euchre was...
Wait, so was he Mr. Belvedere?
No, he wasn't Mr.
Was he
Belvedere.
the dad?
He was...
Or some other principal character.
I don't remember. He wasn't Mr. Belvedere.
Granted, my only knowledge of Mr. Belvedere is through Family Guy, so we're talking pretty limited here.
And they're probably making fun of it if there's...
All I know is Stewie likes it.
So, yeah, and I think it's just great that guys like Euchre, who are a little odd out there, are still calling games. You get to a point where you think, when should the guy stop? But he's still sharp and fun to listen to. If you get a chance to listen to a Brewers broadcast, you will laugh.
I think oddballs and goofiness is such a part of baseball. Just one last, I remember yesterday, or watching the Met game, Keith forgot his Pix 11 shirt. He's wearing it, so he's got a shirt that says the channel name that they're being broadcast on, but he's wearing one with the wrong name on it. So he puts a piece of duct tape over it and writes Pix 11 over the tag.
Oh, he didn't do that. One of the producers on the show.
It's so perfect. That's just so goofy.
Well, the best thing is that, between that, talk about oddballs, because Gary Cohen, who's the other, SNY announcer and Pix 11 announcer, just gleefully goes right after Keith. He couldn't even okay, they're on the air, and today we have an issue. I mean, like that. Welcome to St. Louis. Here's
just straight into roasted.
We have an issue, and Keith actually said, "Well, I'm a dunderhead." So that no one has used that expression probably in 50 years.
Yeah.
Exactly like that. That I'm a dunderhead, and it was very funny. And he's an odd duck too. They're both odd ducks, and that makes an endearing listen when you're listening again. And the same thing is true of Euchre. So I wish there were more current players that we had sort of more understanding of their idiosyncrasies.
Two of them are going to retire this year, and they're going to go into the Hall of Fame, and I truly cannot wait for their Hall of Fame speeches, because Zach Greinke
for sure,
and Joey Votto will give
You're
unbelievable.
Right. You're right.
Votto is hilarious.
You're right. Zach Greinke is pretty funny too.
Greinke is one of the funniest. Greinke is one of the funniest guys ever. There's a great Zach Greinke story where he's standing there talking to one of his teammates. His teammate's telling the story, and Zach goes talking about why people that annoy dogs are really annoying or something, or people that own cats are really annoying. And the teammate goes, "Oh, well, I own a dog. What do you own?" "I own a cat." It's just like, wait, what?
Good call on both of those guys, and I wonder, they're in the end of their careers, and because they've had such great careers, their idiosyncrasies, their weirdness is okay now. But when you're in the prime of your career, you really don't want to be known for the weird guy who's really good.
You have to just be that much better.
Right. So you got to be careful about how far you go with that, because you don't want to make your teammates feel like you're more interested in being weird than being good.
There's kind of like a weird good continuum where the better you are, the more people will allow you to be
They'll
weird.
Put up with that kind of stuff. Yeah. What's the old Manny being Manny?
Yeah, exactly. You put up with Manny being Manny when he hits 312. You will not hit up Manny being Manny when he hits the Mendoza line.
Right. So, we'll find some more oddballs, because it's always fun to talk about these quirky guys.
We can find some really hidden ones next time.
Absolutely.